And therefore, I'd like to turn my attention now to really trying to explain why we believe at Carbon Cap that carbon pricing is one of the most important ways to move the needle on reducing emissions, and how emission trading systems put a price on carbon pollution, and that price then stimulates innovation and a reduction in carbon emissions. So this is former World Bank President Jim Yong Kim. And really, you know, we live in a market-based economy. There are pockets of countries that aren't completely market-based, but generally that is the world we live within. And in a market-based economy, really it is governed by supply, demand, and price. These are the levers that move at scale things around within our global interconnected economy. And therefore, by putting a price on carbon emissions, it sends a strong signal to industry, to consumers about the damages from releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And therefore, it does have damage and it must be priced. And indeed, we are seeing, this is from the World Bank, we are seeing a number of carbon pricing initiatives, which has resulted in a number of carbon markets being created to put a price on emissions and to allow methods that reduce emissions to be compensated. And that's a good point for me to talk about carbon markets themselves. Now, putting a price on carbon, you can put a carbon tax in place, or you can cap and trade carbon. And what I want to talk about here on this slide is the latter, the cap and trade markets and other carbon markets. So there's often confusion around this because there really are three distinct carbon markets. The market that most people are most familiar with is the voluntary market, which you can see on the right here of your graph. This is a relatively small market. It's project related, usually a project in a third world country. Perhaps it's planting trees. Perhaps it's providing clean burning cook stoves to poor communities in the third world. A clean burning cook stove, of course, emits less CO2 than were the family to gather wood from the forest and burn it. So there's a net savings of CO2 emissions. And what these projects will do is they'll calculate that savings based on an install base of those cook stoves, and they will sell carbon offsets or carbon credits for that. The voluntary market has no liquidity, however. The voluntary market has very low levels of regulation, and it's very small. Perhaps this year it'll do about $300 million in total trade, but it is growing, and there's some really interesting projects there. But it needs to scale, and it needs more transparency and better standards. Unfortunately, there have been some nefarious characters that have operated in that market where they've sold carbon credits, and no project ever originated, and investors lost out, or someone who thought they were investing. The second carbon market is in the middle. We call that the international carbon market. Under the United Nations, there was the Clean Development Mechanism was created under the Kyoto Protocol, and this was a means by which countries could create big carbon sequestration projects to meet their commitments under international climate commitments like the Paris Agreement. That market did go through a boom, but it effectively stopped during the global financial crisis in 2008. They're trying to revive that market, and indeed I'm hopeful that they will revive it with robust rules, but currently that market's in suspended animation. So very important to understand these two other markets, which we are not involved in at all. And that brings me to the third market on the left, which is the compliance market. The reason it's called compliance market is because you have to comply. You don't have a choice. If you're a large emitter within a cap and trade emission trading system, you have to comply. And this market has the following three characteristics. It's highly regulated. It's very liquid, trades more than $1 billion per day. There are listed derivatives that are linked to this carbon market. And it typically has much higher carbon prices. And I think for myself anyway, that that tells you a lot about the veracity, about the quality of the carbon. So I hope that helps you understand, because often there's confusion between these different carbon markets. Now specifically, we work in the cap and trade, cap trade and reduce, some people call it, carbon market. So how does this cap and trade emission trading system work? Well, the first thing to understand is that it's a government policy that's meant to cap and reduce emissions. That's the objective of the policy. And for instance, I'll take you through using Europe. Europe is the largest carbon market, covering 28 countries and 3 external countries in Europe. And really any entity that emits more than 25,000 tons of CO2 per year, by law, you're in the program. That means every year you're audited and you must submit carbon allowance certificates each year that match your emissions. If you don't, there are heavy penalties. So any entity is included. So in Europe, there's about 13,000 of the biggest companies, the big emitters, the big polluters that are included, and that covers about half of all the emissions in Europe. The total emissions across Europe are capped at about 1.6 billion tons per year. And every year that cap comes down by about 2% a year. So this gives us the environmental certainty that we want. We want emissions. We want to know that emissions are going to be capped and come down. And the allowances are auctioned on a daily basis in Europe, or if you have a vulnerable business, you are freely allocated, but the amount you're allocated every year drops by that 2%. Each allowance, whether you buy it at auction or you're allocated it, it allows you to emit 1 ton of CO2, and every year you're audited, and you must submit permits at the end of the year that match your emissions. There's also the liquid trading, so cap and trade, and there's trading between the participants, and that sets a price for carbon. And setting a price for carbon is very, very important because it sends a strong price signal to the market. Now, different companies are looking at low carbon options, and they will each have a different price at which it makes sense to switch. So by having a market price, it allows companies to plan, to hedge their carbon emissions into the future, but all the time we know there's a cap, and every year the cap is being lowered, so emissions have to come down. By trading the allowances between the parties, they quickly learn who has the lowest cost of stopping emitting carbon dioxide. And as soon as the carbon price hits that level, that company stops emitting. When the carbon price rises to a higher price, then another whole set of companies, it makes sense they can now switch to another industrial process that emits less or no carbon. So you have this key objective of this policy is not only the environmental objective of capping and reducing, but we want to do it at the lowest cost. And that is what cap and trade delivers. So I hope you're getting the economic elegance of this, of how we harness this market externality, which is what carbon dioxide emissions are. They're external to the economy. They don't have a specific price in most countries, but they do have a definite damage to our economies. So this cap and trade addresses that and allows it to be priced. The other really interesting thing is a liquid carbon price and a liquid carbon market that fosters huge innovation among entrepreneurs, scientists. It gives a direct incentive to venture capitalists to back people with low carbon technology because they can monetize that technology. Again, we live in a market-based economy. So this is the other, I think, beauty of a cap and trade in a liquid carbon market. It fosters innovation and allows people to develop interesting, innovative technology for low carbon. One last point is that I want to point out that in most cap and trade markets, the majority of the revenue from auctioning these carbon allowances every year, which is quite significant, is reinvested in green initiatives, low carbon technology. And this really is an image that captures that. And the yellow dotted line is the cap. The cap comes down every year. So we have this environmental certainty about lowering our emissions, meeting our policy goals, while at the same time doing it at the lowest cost. Since the program was implemented in Europe in 2005, that's when it was launched, emissions in Europe are down 1 billion tons per annum. That is significant. In a world of 37 billion tons today, a billion moves the needle. And while there are many, many interesting things that can lower emissions, to do it on this scale is huge. As the carbon price has moved up in the last 3 years from a low of, in the 5 to 10 euro per ton range to today's price of about 20 euros, that has meant that burning coal as an electric utilities burn coal or gas to make electricity. And coal has twice the carbon emissions for the same thermal efficiency as gas. So when the carbon price moves up, it means coal is not profitable. Did these utilities shut down coal production because they were moral or ethical? No. They shut down burning coal because it became unprofitable. And that's the impact of putting a price on carbon emissions. It bites the companies where it makes an impact, and it changes behavior. So emissions trading systems, they can move the needle in terms of emissions. These are the numbers. I've listed the 3 main carbon markets that we invest into. Europe, RGGI, which is 10 states on the east coast of the United States, California, which is linked with Quebec in Canada. And you can see that in these markets, they've broken the link between higher emissions and GDP. So by capping and lowering emissions, it does not doom your economy because you're providing this price signal. Korea launched a market over 500 million tons, and emission trading systems today cover 8% of emissions and 30% of GDP, and have raised over $57 billion in auction proceeds. The big news is China, notwithstanding Corona. The big news is China has been running 8 pilot emission trading systems now for more than 6 years, and they're rolling these into a national emission trading system. The biggest carbon market in the world will be in China next year, covering 3.3 billion tons. That is huge news for environmentalists. Many other countries are now launching. This is a map that shows that there's 8 in force, but there's 4 scheduled and 9 other countries in consideration. Indonesia is launching, Philippines is launching, Mexico is in their pilot phase already, and many other countries are considering launching a cap and trade carbon market. And that certainly is a trend we need to carry on.